Some hotels get one shot at reinvention. The Four Seasons Oahu at Ko Olina has quietly burned through 3 identities before breakfast. Chapter 2. Designed Tides at Four Seasons Oahu follows a traveler settling into a resort that started life as a Japanese-financed dream in 1993, briefly wore a Marriott badge, and then arrived at its current self after a 2016 renovation that widened the windows and, apparently, the ambitions. The lagoons are managed. The canoe went back to the Bishop Museum, and somewhere between Roy's and a recalibrated lobby, West Oahu turns out to be running a far more complicated ledger than the poolside menu suggests. We knew we had truly committed to the bit of a 15th anniversary celebration when we returned to the exact same type of suite where we once stayed as a younger, less solvent couple, only to find the building had aged better than we had. Reoccupying our original quarters in West Oahu, I found that what was once a sensible JW Marriott during the construction of Disney's Aulani next door had metamorphosed into a Four Seasons. Reaching this realization did not make us masters of observation. It merely made us accidental auditors of the high-stakes real estate arbitrage that fuels the Hawaiian tourism economy. The property itself is a massive concrete monument to the tail end of the Japanese asset price bubble, a structure designed with surplus 1980s capital that has now settled into a comfortable, citrus-scented middle age. Born in December 1993 as the Ihelani Resort and Spa, it was a dream of developer Herbert Harita intended to be monumental and ceremonial. It featured the kind of grand axial layouts and inward-facing formality that architects love and bank accounts hate. Naturally, the resort's opening coincided perfectly with the collapse of the Japanese economy, leading to a financial implosion so severe it usually results in a property becoming a Spirit Halloween franchise. However, this devastating public setback paradoxically became the irreplaceable currency for the resort's most profound rise in status. Because the building was constructed with bubble-era bones, vast footprints and structural indulgences that modern zoning laws would laugh out of the room, the Four Seasons inherited a spatial grandeur that no contemporary accountant would authorize. By stripping away the dark woods of the Marriott era and opening the sightlines, they turned a financial failure into a triumphant, breezy second act. The engineering outside is even more aggressive. The resort sits on Honu Lagoon, which looks like a serene embrace of nature, but actually proves that 1980s engineers viewed geology as a suggestion rather than a rule. Because the natural leeward coast was a jagged mess of limestone and fossil reef, these visionaries used controlled explosives to excavate the swimming coves. They blasted the coast into submission and reused the debris for seawalls. It is a level of landscape gardening bordering on localized warfare, creating a calm, protected water experience that nature had rudely declined to provide. The lobby felt different in other ways too. 5 years ago, during the height of the pandemic, when Hawaii embraced a level of red tape that would make a minor deity struggle to gain entry, the islands were devoid of international voices. Now, Japanese tourists have returned, restoring the economic ecosystem to its natural order. The service, which had dipped during the Wild West days of the recovery, has mercifully clicked back into the high-precision Four Seasons standard. We celebrated this return to normalcy at La Hiki Kitchen, an open-air venue by the pool where the breakfast buffet for 2 costs approximately $150. It is a price point suggesting the eggs are laid by the golden goose itself, yet one pays it gladly for the privilege of not cooking. Adjacent to the manicured grounds lies Lanikūhonua, a cultural estate once favored by Hawaiian royalty like Kamehameha I. It operates as a cultural buffer, ensuring that the coastline remains a place of ceremony rather than becoming another condo tower, at least for now. Later, we embarked on a pilgrimage to Roy's for lunch. The service moved with the leisurely pace of continental drift, but the view of the golf course remains undefeated. It is a fusion experience, much like the local convenience stores we raided afterward, places where American commerce hugs Pacific necessity, offering Spam sushi alongside Cool Ranch Doritos in a culinary détente. We decided to breach the resort containment field. Venturing out of the bubble, however, offered a starker history lesson than the brochure promised. The drive toward Kaʻena Point State Park and Keawaula Beach revealed a grim shift in the island's social fabric. 10 years ago, the tents were contained to the urban sprawl. Today, the encampments have migrated to the coast, a visible symptom of a mental health crisis that feels entirely unmanaged. At one point, a man stepped directly into traffic with 3 dogs trailing behind him in a chaotic procession, indifferent to the laws of physics or momentum. Was he a local deity testing our brakes, or merely a man who found the concept of crosswalks to be an oppressive construct of the Western mind? It was a stark indicator that just beyond the manicured hedges of Ko Olina, the Wild West is very much alive. Despite this, the natural beauty manages to persist with stubborn grace. At the beach, we found solace in the tide pools, where I spotted a few baby triggerfish, the humuhumunukunukuapua'a, if you have the time and the vowels to spare, darting among the rocks. We stood at Kaʻena Point State Park, which was likely the first thing Captain Cook sighted of the Hawaiian Islands, though Europeans had encountered Polynesian people before that, usually abruptly. Spanish ghost maps haunting Hawaii. It is a common enough narrative. The British explorer arriving with his charts and his mutton chops to slap an English name on a place that already had one. But to assume Captain Cook was the first European in the broader neighborhood severely underestimates the wandering ambition of the Iberian Peninsula. The ocean stretching before me was not an empty canvas awaiting an Englishman. It was a graveyard of ghost ships, failed math, and rigid trade corridors. Spanish navigators actually broke the European seal on the Pacific, violently engaging with Polynesian communities nearly 2 centuries before the British or French bothered to fund expeditions. Their early resume is expansive, if fiercely self-serving. In 1595, Álvaro de Mendaña made landfall in the Marquesas Islands, a significant early contact he immediately leveraged for professional gain. Mendaña named the archipelago Las Marquesas de Mendoza after his patron, the Viceroy of Peru, proving that aggressive sycophancy is a tradition as old as offshore navigation itself. Their footprint expanded with a confusing scattershot of stopovers. Mendaña had already sighted Nui in modern Tuvalu during an earlier trip, unimaginatively christening it Isla de Jesus for no other reason than the calendar date. Later, Pedro Fernández de Queiroz managed to locate Tikopia and the Duff Islands, Polynesian cultural outliers sitting geographically within the Solomon chain. By 1770, a Spanish squadron explicitly formally annexed Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, for the crown. They marched onto the shore, planted a flag, claimed the land, and then completely abandoned establishing an administration. It was the geopolitical equivalent of calling dibs on an island and promptly losing the paperwork. Looking out from the hot sands of West Oʻahu, I considered the Spanish theory, a persistent concept that posits Spanish galleons sailing the lucrative Manila to Acapulco run stumbled upon Hawaii long before Cook. It is a mathematically appealing hypothesis. The Spanish were sailing back and forth across this ocean for 2.5 centuries. Surely one of them looked out a porthole, saw massive volcanic mountains sticking out of the water and thought, that looks habitable. Proponents of this theory generally point to old charts featuring islands labeled La Mesa or Los Majos, hovering somewhere near the correct latitude. Most modern scholarship suggests these are cartographic ghosts, likely misplaced drawings of Micronesian islands that drifted across the parchment due to bad math and dead reckoning. The historical reality is painfully pragmatic. Spanish captains made a rigid calculation regarding their own survival. They optimized their routes for wind, entirely abandoning curiosity. The trade winds created a localized dead zone that kept the Spanish employed and alive, but profoundly ignorant of Hawaii. Westbound ships rode the steady airflows near 12 degrees north, making a nervous, predictable beeline for Guam. Eastbound ships, heavy with silver and terrified of storms, climbed way up into the northern mid-30s to catch the westerlies back toward North America. This created a massive navigational gap, roughly between 19 and 22 degrees north, where the Hawaiian chain sits in splendid isolation. The Spanish effectively commuted around the archipelago for 200 years, protecting their cargo schedules with a rigid discipline that modern logistics companies can only envy. The silence of the archives supports the wind. There are no log entries of a Hawaiian landfall hidden away in Seville or Mexico. The ground beneath my feet offers the same silence. Excavations in pre-contact layers yield no Spanish iron, no Iberian ceramics, and no trade glass. Even the language shows no borrowing of Spanish words, a stark contrast to how rapidly Hawaiians absorbed English terms post-1778. Surrounded by the invisible wake of navigators who missed a volcanic paradise by a few degrees of latitude, I stood contemplating the immense weight of this historical near-miss. Navigators driven solely by commerce produced a jagged, stepwise map of the ocean, etching out rigid corridors of trade while leaving vast, wealthy pockets of the Pacific entirely unexamined for over a century. Abel Tasman and New Zealand's false start. Far to the south, gales battered the hull of the Heemskerk. Her timbers screamed in protest as the ship surfed the violently unromantic roaring forties, a belt of winds that howls across the bottom of the map. While the Spanish galleons were busy ghosting the Hawaiian timeline to protect their porcelain schedules, the Dutch East India Company had directed Abel Tasman to plunge into this aerodynamic nightmare. The VOC was a corporate entity with the exploratory instincts of a ruthless hedge fund. Tasman's mission was to find the unknown Southland and preferably something worth liquidating. It is easy to cast Tasman as history's ultimate misunderstood middle manager. His voyages in the mid-17th century fundamentally redrew the European map of the Pacific, yet his superiors deemed the whole affair a commercial flop because he returned without gold, silver, or a polite agreement to trade nutmeg. He is best known today for being the first recorded European to sight Tasmania and New Zealand. This distinction likely offered little comfort during his annual performance review. Tasman's 1642 expedition launched from Batavia with two ships, the Heemskerk and the Zeeheim, on a quest to locate Terra Australis. This was a hypothetical continent that cartographers insisted must exist to balance the landmass of the Northern Hemisphere. Did these map makers care that this is not how geology works? Absolutely not. They were very confident, and confidence is half the battle in geography. Acting on the advice of his head navigator Franz Wiescher, Tasman rode the southern gales to maximize his chances of hitting something solid. On November 24, 1642, he sighted the west coast of Tasmania. In a maneuver of supreme corporate bootlicking, he named it Van Diemen's Land after the Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies, hoping the boss would notice the tribute on the final report. Pressing east, he sighted the South Island of New Zealand on December 13, 1642. He claimed first European eyes on the prize and named it Staten Land. He operated under the fatalistic assumption that it connected to South America, part of the massive imaginary continent he was obsessed with verifying. One might ask how a 17th-century Dutch trade mission concerns the relaxation requirements of a modern Hawaiian vacation. However, understanding the Pacific requires acknowledging that Tasman's first contact with the indigenous Maori people in Golden Bay set a grim precedent for cross-cultural relations. On December 18th and 19th, 1642, A waka belonging to the local Ngati Tumatakokiri people rammed a small Dutch boat. The Dutch, displaying a tragic lack of localized social awareness, used trumpets to signal between their ships. The Maori likely interpreted the brass section not as a jaunty tune, but as a challenge to battle. In the ensuing clash, 4 Dutch sailors were killed. Tasman named the location Moordenaars Bay, weighed anchor and fled without ever setting foot on the soil. He sailed north, mistaking the Cook Strait for a mere bay, a cartographic error that persisted until someone checked his math a century later. In 1644, the VOC, apparently gluttons for disappointment, sent Tasman on a second expedition to see if New Guinea connected to Australia. He charted the north coast of Australia but missed the Torres Strait due to conservative seamanship. From the VOC's perspective, without easy trade routes, Tasman was a write-off. Yet his data allowed the cartographer Joan Bleu to create the Tasman map, renaming the land New Zealand. It would take 127 years before James Cook returned with chronometers and a distinct lack of trumpet-based diplomacy to fully chart the gaps Tasman left behind. Reflecting on these grand, messy historical intersections often requires a change of scenery. I marked the day with a lavish breakfast, followed by a leisurely lunch at Roy's, gazing out at golf course views that felt suspiciously manicured. We made stops at fusion-style convenience stores where Spam Sushi sat comfortably next to standard snacks, a culinary alliance considerably more successful than Tasman's foreign policy. Pele, Po, and Hawaii's burning gods. Later that afternoon, wrestling with a frictionless digital interface that possessed all the warmth of a vengeful deity brought a certain perspective to ancient theology. Staring at the loading screen of a rented sedan, one can easily see why earlier inhabitants of these islands preferred a pantheon that governed the foundational elements of existence with clear, albeit sometimes bloody, rules. The traditional Hawaiian belief system is anchored by 4 principal deities known as the Akua Nui, or Great Gods. They emerged from a state of primordial darkness known as Po. Delegating cosmic creation to this quartet probably seemed entirely pragmatic to a civilization managing the daily realities of agriculture, navigation, and warfare across an isolated archipelago. The division of divine labor among the 4 great gods was highly specific. Cain held the portfolio for creation, the sky, fresh water, and life itself. According to traditional chants, he formed the first human out of red clay mixed with his own spittle, after which 2 of his colleagues breathed life into the figure. Because he was a strictly life-affirming deity, his worship explicitly forbade the taking of human life, and in celestial navigation, he governed the northern edge of the sky. Ku operated in stark contrast. As the god of war, politics, and land conquest, Ku was the figure invoked during military campaigns. His worship at the elite Luakini temples sometimes required highly structured ritual human sacrifice to transfer spiritual power, or mana, and secure divine favor for the ruling chiefs. Lono governed fertility, agriculture, rain, music, and peace. He presided over the annual Makahiki festival, a sacred season of harvest and celebration during which all warfare ceased. Over a century after Tasman sailed the South Pacific, the British explorer James Cook had the extraordinary geographical timing to arrive in Hawaii precisely during this season. This led the locals to initially honor him with the ritual reverence associated with Lono, a misunderstanding that ultimately did not end well for the captain. The 4th major god, Kanaloa, handled the deep ocean, navigation, and occasionally the underworld. Often paired as a companion to Cain, Kanaloa governed the southern celestial path and was heavily invoked during open water voyaging. His physical body forms included the banana plant and the octopus, or as one chant notably describes him, the foul-smelling squid. Connecting marine life to land-based healing, Kanaloa rounded out a primary executive team that shared deep roots across the Pacific, alongside the trickster hero Maui, who was famously known for slowing the sun and fishing up islands. One might assume that constructing an entire universe and pulling island chains from the sea would adequately stock any belief system, but local geology invariably overrides imported theology. Because the Hawaiian Islands are an active volcanic chain, early settlers realized their inherited Polynesian models lacked a suitably terrifying figure for molten rock, prompting the evolution of highly localized deities to explain the extreme environments. The most famous of these unique adaptations is Pele, the goddess of volcanoes, lava, and fire. To explain the geological realities of the archipelago, she is believed to have traveled from a distant land known as Kahiki to build her fire pit, and she currently resides in the active crater of Kilauea. Pele embodies a paradox of destruction and creation. Her lava flows overrun forests and incinerate landscapes, but they also create fresh soil and expand the island coastline, making her an active, living force in the geology of Hawaii. The pantheon also maintained local spirits tied to specific microenvironments. The island of Lanai is home to legends of Akua Ino, a shape-shifting tester god who haunts the harsh, wind-blasted landscapes of the island. Rather than acting as a traditional hero, he disguises himself as a weary traveler or fisherman to expose human arrogance, greed, and carelessness. Constantly hovering around in elaborate disguises, demanding free fish, trapping stressed locals in endless moral evaluations, and aggressively documenting their lack of hospitality, sounds less like ancient mythology and more like an unmanageable middle manager whose escalating interpersonal quirks finally forced an exasperated leadership team to permanently reassign him to the most desolate regional branch available. These localized legends mapped divine hierarchy directly onto grounded reality. A traveling fire goddess explained geological violence, while an exiled tester spirit punished poor hospitality. Across the archipelago, oral tradition routinely transformed physical isolation, rigid class divisions, and new waves of settlement into compelling mythology. Menehune, Kauai, and the Midnight Masonry. For all the terrifying grandeur of volcanic deities and shape-shifting spirits testing mortal arrogance across the archipelago, the actual, back-breaking work of early civilization required an entirely different, infinitely more exhausted workforce. According to folklore, this staggering responsibility fell to the Menehune. They were described as an ancient race of small, profoundly industrious beings who inhabited the remote valleys and carried out unglamorous civic projects with a level of nocturnal efficiency that would make a modern supply chain manager weep in sheer inadequacy. They were credited with immense feats of engineering, constructing elaborate temples, stone fish ponds, and sprawling irrigation ditches exclusively at night. Their labor contracts apparently included a strict sunrise expiration clause. If a single human laid eyes on them, or if the dawn broke before the final stone was placed, they would drop their tools and abandon the project for eternity. That reaction seems less like magical mystique and more like a fiercely enforced workers' union boundary. Two of their most ambitious alleged creations still sit on the island of Kauai. The Alikoko fish pond features a 900-foot stone wall that oral tradition claims was constructed in a single night by a 25-mile human chain of menehune passing basalt blocks hand to hand. Meanwhile, the irrigation channel known as the Menehune Ditch utilized finely cut stones rather than the rough, unbothered lava rock that characterized later construction. Modern archaeologists safely attribute both structures to highly skilled native Hawaiian labor, mostly because history reliably prefers an engineering miracle to the mundane reality of organized masonry. The archaeological record lacks any physical evidence of diminutive twilight builders. Scholars, who generally require more than municipal legends of magical rock hauling to establish an excavation site, propose a far more grounded explanation. The Menehune likely represent the very real, original Polynesian settlers who were effectively demoted by a second, remarkably aggressive wave of arrivals from Tahiti. The linguistic puzzle pieces fit cleanly together, as the Tahitian word manahune translates directly to a commoner or lower-class person. Did the conquering elite truly believe these earlier inhabitants lacked spiritual mana, or was it simply convenient to rebrand the island's founders as an administrative underclass fit only for manual labor? Escaping the new hierarchy, the original settlers were pushed into the steep, mountainous interiors, permanently disappearing into the topography. Over centuries, the factual memory of subjugation dissolved into a highly useful civic myth. Attributing pre-existing infrastructure to a magical race allowed the new ruling alii to claim the island's improvements without ever having to acknowledge the displaced population who actually built them. By framing the original inhabitants as a secretive, nocturnal species laboring entirely for the benefit of the new aristocracy, the rulers neatly cemented their own political dominance. The fiction insulated the ruling class from the brutal realities of rock hauling while sending a clear warning to the general public to stay indoors at night and not tamper with the municipal water supply. Following European contact, this complex method of social control absorbed imported stories of brownies and dwarves, shrinking the builders down to harmless fairy tale proportions. The absorption of a conquered people into a phantom workforce leaves an uneasy resonance in the heavy basalt walls that still trap the rising tide. The stones lock together with a precision that speaks of quiet desperation, constructed by hands that vanished into the upland mists to avoid the scrutiny of conquerors who would eventually forget their faces but rely forever on their stolen architecture. The myth obscures the men, casting a long, strange shadow over the valleys where the silence of the forests feels less like magic and more like the calculated stillness of those waiting out the day. Erasing a displaced population through folklore, however, was merely a strategy for managing the past. To control the living, the new aristocracy would rely on an infinitely more rigid and unforgiving framework of divine enforcement. Mana and blood at Puʻukahola Heiau. Total control over an island required more than just rebranding subjugated predecessors as nocturnal ditch diggers. It demanded an absolute monopoly on mana, a form of spiritual power considered strictly necessary for the success of any traditional Hawaiian kingdom. Sensationalized historical fiction often paints human sacrifice as an everyday occurrence, but the actual practice was exceedingly limited. It was governed by the ironclad rules of the kapu system. These offerings were inherently exclusive affairs, restricted to the highest tier of temples known as Luakini Heiau, which were dedicated specifically to Ku, the Hawaiian god of war. The main objective of these solemn events was to stockpile divine favor before attempting anything ambitious, such as launching a massive military campaign or consecrating a new temple. Officiating such a ceremony was an unpleasantly physical task. The high priests, known as kahuna, conducted the rites and would periodically anoint themselves with the sweat of the victims. This procedural step naturally ensured no one else wanted their job. At the culmination of the ceremony, a chief might ritually accept the eye of the victim to secure a divine mandate. It is worth noting that this had absolutely nothing to do with cannibalism. The consumption of human flesh was considered repulsive by the general Hawaiian public, who strongly preferred their political rituals to be cleanly symbolic rather than culinary. Sourcing acceptable offerings was a logistical challenge. Victims were drawn from a highly specific demographic consisting of captured rival chiefs, spectacular lawbreakers, or members of the Kaʻena, a hereditary servile underclass selectively maintained for war captivity and ritual requirements. When Kamehameha the Great received a prophecy stating he would unite the islands if he built the monumental Puʻukahola Heiau for his personal war god, he knew he needed a heavily impactful sacrifice to make the mystical paperwork legitimate. He predictably set his sights on his chief rival, Keawaula. Aware that his designated role in the upcoming temple consecration was to be the primary structural offering, Keawaula responded with a calculated act of physical defiance. He intentionally mutilated himself to become an imperfect sacrifice. From the perspective of the officiating priests, this was an astonishing breakdown in ceremonial propriety. Instead of recognizing his actions as a profound statement of personal sovereignty and political resistance, the temple administrators likely logged the incident as a deeply frustrating clerical error. The victim had completely failed to maintain the required aesthetic standards of the ritual. It was a severe breach of etiquette that forced the priests to proceed with substandard metaphysical materials, thoroughly frustrating the academic symmetry of their consecration protocol. Despite his aggressive disregard for expected ceremonial manners, Keawaula was ultimately killed and offered anyway, securing the spiritual leverage required for Kamehameha's rise to absolute supremacy. This rigid ideological framework collapsed with surprising speed following the death of Kamehameha in 1819. His successor, Liholiho, accompanied by the influential Queen Ka'ahumanu, orchestrated a dramatic social revolution called Ainoa, or free eating. This organized act systematically dismantled the strict social rules of the kapu system. Without the old religious laws mandating the physical transfer of mana, the sociological need for human sacrifice vanished overnight, and many of the grand heiau associated with the practice were subsequently destroyed. As the remaining royalty converted to Christianity and began adopting Western legal codes under missionary guidance, the transition became a permanent reality. The final vestiges of the practice, alongside infanticide, were formally outlawed by the penal codes established between 1824 and 1825. Harvesting an imperfect rival for temple consecration under the revised laws did not make an ambitious leader the divine ruler of the islands. It made him an accidental capital offender. Captain Cook and Hawaii's cannibal myth. The formal temple offerings designed to transfer spiritual power to the gods were entirely distinct from actual human consumption. That nuance was thoroughly lost on visiting sailors. They witnessed elite bone preservation flowing from those same religious laws and immediately assumed their fallen captain was being processed into an artisanal gas station meat stick. Cannibalism was incredibly taboo in indigenous Hawaiian culture, viewed with deep disgust rather than appetite. Much of the widespread myth surrounding the practice stems from foreigners aggressively misinterpreting ceremonial traditions, most famously following Captain James Cook's death at Kealakekua Bay in 1779. After Cook fell in battle, Hawaiians carried his body away to grant him the ultimate gesture of honor reserved for a powerful adversary. They undertook a grand, fiery ritual of cosmic reverence to prepare his remains. The corpse was heated over a fire to loosen the flesh, so his bones could be carefully cleaned and distributed to leading chiefs as sacred relics imbued with mana. Visiting British sailors simply saw a heated torso positioned over an open flame and assumed an act of culinary desecration was underway. The heating of the body was strictly a preparatory step for bone preservation, not a beachside luau. Early Westerners also routinely misunderstood Hawaiian political metaphors. The formidable chief Kamehameha I was occasionally given the poetic title of the High Chief who eats the islands, a phrase meant purely to describe his military dominance. If you jump to literal dietary conclusions about foreign political poetry, that cultural rumor mill will fulfill its obvious purpose. Namely, it will ruin your historical accuracy with a cheerful lack of empathy. Kamehameha was just conquering territory, not treating the Pacific archipelago like an extreme tasting menu. When cannibalism actually appears in traditional accounts, it is exclusively attributed to unwelcome outsiders or a specific, deeply despised group known as the Lo'ai Kanaka, which translates directly to the people-eaters. These figures were generally foreign chiefs or stragglers from an older society, and they were considered utterly repulsive by the general populace. As noted by highly regarded authorities on local mythology like Martha Beckwith, there is no proof that cannibalism was ever practiced in the Hawaiian group. The stories that do survive are simply harsh moral lessons about a detested custom. This cultural condemnation is perfectly captured in the folklore surrounding Oʻahunui, an ancient king on the island of Oʻahu who allowed himself to be seduced by the forbidden feasts of the Lo'ai Kanaka. Ignoring the desperate warnings of his subjects, the king gave in to his unnatural cravings and eventually killed and served his own nephews. When the boy's father, Lehuanui, discovered the gruesome outcome, he did not bother petitioning a royal court for justice. He approached the king and delivered his verdict with the heavy, final thud of a stone adze severing a neck. The gods then handed down their own permanent judgment, transfiguring the headless king and his remaining followers into solid rock to the dreadful grinding scrape of bone, hardening into basalt. Hawaii Beyond Pineapple, Volcano Fruit Truths. That same engineered fusion extends past the convenience store and right into the resort landscaping. Long before a labyrinth of digital barcodes dispensed modern rental vehicles to newly arrived guests, the Hawaiian Islands received oceanic voyagers whose wooden hulls permanently altered the local botanical reality. Most visitors look at the manicured resort grounds and assume they are observing a native tropical orchard. The history of regional fruit, however, is a curious saga of massive sea crossings, corporate agriculture, and extreme evolutionary relaxation. Because this massive archipelago is situated thousands of miles away from any major continent, incredibly few edible fruiting plants ever arrived via wind, water, or migratory birds before the dawn of human settlement. Instead, the fruits scattered across the landscape today belong to three deeply specific historical chapters: commercial imports, ancient canoe plants, and the quiet native survivors. The pineapple might be the quintessential mascot of the export economy, but nearly every other sweet novelty synonymous with the regional tourism brand is a foreign transplant. During the agricultural booms of the 19th and 20th centuries, waves of foreign vegetation were imported to build an export market and construct a very specific tropical image. The familiar roster reads like a global geography exam. Papayas originated in southern Mexico. Mangoes hail from South Asia. Passion fruit, known locally as lilikoi, originally sprouted in South America. Guavas have Central American roots and macadamia nuts, despite their iconic local status, actually originated in Australia. Even before the major plantation eras, high-ranking Hawaiian chiefs sought to expand their agricultural wealth by importing new fruiting trees from afar. In the late 1780s, the traveling chief Kaʻena returned from a long voyage to Canton, China, bringing citrus stock among his gifts. He utilized these foreign introductions to increase his political influence and provisioning capabilities back home, proving that international diplomacy is always improved by the presence of a dependable snack. Going back much further, the original Polynesian voyagers who settled the islands roughly 1,500 years ago carried their own staple crops across the ocean. Hunger drafted the earliest botanical maps. While these crops are completely embedded in ancient Hawaiian culture and survival, botanically speaking, they are still considered introduced species. These essential canoe plants were cultivated across the Pacific by Austronesian and Lapita ancestors, whose unique horticulture relied heavily on tree crops. The primary fruiting plants transported in those ancient vessels included coconuts, breadfruit, and bananas. Bananas proved to be an especially crucial traveling crop. Linguistic and botanical evidence traces the spread of specific varieties back to their origins in the Solomon Islands. An upright fruiting banana called the fei was carried eastward across the ocean by early voyagers, treating the unfathomably vast Pacific like a highly inconvenient grocery aisle. To find a fruit that practically grows from the volcanic rock and exists absolutely nowhere else on Earth, one must look past the lowland farms and ascend the slopes of the active craters. Two highly notable native fruits successfully adapted to these rugged, high-elevation environments. The ohelo berry is the most famous, truly endemic specimen. A botanical relative of the cranberry and blueberry, the ohelo bush thrives in an extreme environment that would quickly kill a delicate greenhouse flower. It grows directly out of the harsh, rocky lava flows and ash dunes of high-altitude volcanoes. These tart and slightly sweet berries hold profound cultural significance, as they are sacred to Pele, the Hawaiian goddess of fire and volcanoes. Traditional protocol dictates that a traveler must offer their first harvested ohelo berries to Pele before consuming any themselves. This is excellent etiquette when dealing with anyone, but it becomes especially vital when that individual is a deity composed entirely of molten rock. Higher up in the wet mountain forests grows the akala, the endemic Hawaiian raspberry. Unlike the tiny raspberries found in a mainland supermarket, akala berries are massive, often growing an inch or two long. The plant also boasts a fascinating evolutionary adaptation. Over thousands of years, it shed its defensive thorns. Because the islands evolved completely without grazing mammals like goats and pigs, the bushes simply discarded their armor. An ocean moat served as sufficient defense against non-existent mouths, allowing the plant to commit fully to the production of giant, unprotected fruit. This botanical history outlines a geographic paradox where sweet, uniform produce was imported from afar to sell a generic tropical dream, while the original flora waits further up the incline. Down along the manicured coastlines, predictable mangoes and papayas drop into waiting hands, engineered for an easy harvest. Up in the volcanic fog, the true endemic survivors root deeply into fractured basalt and weathered ash. These rare mountain berries guard a sharper flavor, shaped by thin air and cooled lava, keeping their tartness reserved for the steep, uneven heights where the land remembers how to be alone. Kauai O'o, Hawaii's unanswered duet. Descending from the high volcanic ridges where native berries manage a thornless survival, the ecological record of the islands reveals a sudden emptiness. This void feels less like a slow process of natural selection and more like the universal signal of a landlord arriving early to collect rent, prompting all the tenants to quietly pack up and disappear. The extreme isolation that allowed unique flora to thrive here also engineered exceptionally vulnerable animal life. Many of the now absent forest birds were deeply tethered to traditional Hawaiian culture. Their bright plumage was meticulously harvested to manufacture the spectacular ahu ula, feather cloaks, and mahiola helmets worn by high chiefs. The mamo, known scientifically as Drepanus pacifica, was a black honey creeper sporting brilliant golden shoulder patches, making it a highly desirable fashion accessory. King Kamehameha I owned a famous cloak requiring the feathers of tens of thousands of these birds, which is a staggering volume of plumage for a single garment. The mamo predictably vanished by the early 20th century. Its final accepted sighting occurred around 1898, leaving the species to exist today only as stuffed specimens resting in climate-controlled collections down the hill at the Bishop Museum. The honey-eaters, known collectively as the Oʻahu, faced a similar vocational hazard. Their downy yellow flank feathers were heavily sought after for royal tailoring. Early traditions possessed a functional elegance, dictating that a hunter should catch the bird using sap-covered branches, pluck merely a few choice yellow feathers, and then release the creature back into the canopy. Later, commercial hunting and sudden environmental shifts broke this sustainable ethic entirely. The genus included several island-specific varieties across Hawaii, Oʻahu, Molokai, and Kauai, all of which are now extinct. The Kauai Oʻahu held out the longest. Biologist Jim Jacoby recorded a lone male in the Alakai Plateau in the 1980s. The bird sang an unanswered duet call, a recording of which now safely resides in the Macaulay Library as a rather haunting acoustic file. Along with the matching loss of a bird called the Keawaula, the disappearance of all the Oʻahu species marks a grim scientific milestone. The Mohoidae family holds the distinction of being the only entire avian family to completely go extinct in modern times. Because these birds served as the literal fabric of local royalty, losing the entire Mohoidae lineage on a single island chain is an aristocratic continuity error roughly equivalent to historians misplacing the entire Tudor dynasty during a brief excursion into the countryside. A few Molokai candidates stubbornly resist definitive classification. The bright red kakawahie, or Molokai creeper, is considered entirely extinct, with its last accepted record logged in 1963. The olomau, a local Molokai thrush, occupies a more ambiguous administrative shadow. It is officially classified as unknown or possibly extinct rather than definitively gone. Its last confirmed detection was in 1980, yet the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service keeps the file open. The rugged and largely unsurveyed terrain of the Olakui Plateau offers a geographic alibi, bolstered by a 2021 unconfirmed thrush-like acoustic detection logged by observers positioned off a cliff. Despite this slim glimmer of hope, most experts believe the bird is extinct, treating the acoustic blip with the same polite skepticism afforded to historical maritime mirages. While the tremendous demand for feathers placed intense early pressure on these populations, their ultimate demise involved a coalition of new threats. The destruction of their habitats, the introduction of non-native predators, and the arrival of avian malaria spread by introduced mosquitoes systemically erased them. Evolving for millennia without exposure to such diseases meant the birds completely lacked natural immunity. The rapid spread of malaria decimated the lower elevations, pushing the surviving honey creepers to retreat upward into high-elevation refuges where the mosquitoes could not physically reach them. This pattern of disappearance extends beyond the isolated tree line and into the saltwater. The deep evolutionary history of the highly endangered Hawaiian monk seal reveals that it belongs to the genus Monachus, a classification that historically included 3 distinct species of warm-water seals. While both the Hawaiian monk seal and the Mediterranean monk seal are still clinging to a tenuous survival in their respective oceans, their relative, the Caribbean monk seal, is now completely extinct. The naturalist William Beebe articulated the finality of these ecological voids. The beauty and genius of a work of art may be reconceived, though its first material expression be destroyed. A vanished harmony may yet again inspire the composer, but when the last individual of a race of living things breathes no more, another heaven and another earth must pass before such a one can be again. And that brings us to the close of Chapter 2, Designed Tides at Four Seasons Oahu. If there's one thing this chapter quietly insists on, it's that a resort can be renovated without being reimagined, but Ko Olina's current version at least seems to know the difference between the two. Coming up in Chapter 3, the focus shifts to the Big Island and to the White Cook Monument at Keaweula Bay, where one traveler's decade-old decision to skip snorkeling becomes the starting point for a much longer reckoning with Cook's voyages, Hawaiian sovereignty, and the gap between how history gets told and who it actually belonged to. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community on Patreon. When a traveler skips snorkeling at Keaweula Bay and stands instead at the White Cook Monument, the choice quietly asks whose story this coastline is actually telling. That question opens Chapter 3 of The Rise the Limit, Snorkel Tomorrow, Rethink Cook Today, where a returned offhand joke about Cook and Hawaiians lands badly enough to send one person into a years-long search for the fuller picture. It turns out Cook's death at that very bay wasn't a tragedy interrupting Hawaiian history, but a moment that Hawaiian protocol, power and sovereign calculation had already shaped long before any musket was raised. Given the favourable winds of the air conditioning and the total absence of scurvy at the Four Seasons breakfast buffet, I resolved to chart a course through the perilous depths of my own memory. While my current mornings involve gazing at the engineered lagoons of Ko Olina and contemplating the geological drift of the Emperor Seamounts, my mind kept snapping back to a specific jagged coastline I encountered a decade ago. It was a pilgrimage to the Big Island, a journey I undertook with the intense gravity of a Georgian explorer mapping uncharted waters, though my vessel was a rented Ford Focus, and my armor was largely SPF 50. Most travelers flock to that particular corner of the island to harass sea turtles and gaze at the yellow tangs. I bypassed the fluorescent aquatic traffic to stare at a white obelisk known as the Cook Monument. This solitary marker identifies the exact square footage of rock where Captain James Cook, the 18th century's most relentless human astrolabe, went from being a deity to a footnote in a much larger Hawaiian saga of sovereign pride. My focus bypassed the man who discovered these islands for European mapmakers. I was instead fascinated by the grueling years of personal transformation that forged his character long before his fatal final voyage. He remains a compelling figure for anyone who prefers their historical subjects to be competent rather than charismatic. James Cook's origin story reads like a grim parable of northern drudgery, rejected by publishers for being excessively dreary. It begins in the North Riding of Yorkshire, where a farm boy from Marton and later Great Ayton learned the crushing weight of labour long before he learned the curvature of the earth. By his teenage years, he was apprenticed at Staithes and subsequently moved to the sooty, bustling port of Whitby. These Whitby years spanned 1746 to 1755 and were emphatically not spent frolicking. Living among cat-built colliers, sturdy, flat-bottomed coal ships that handled with the aquatic grace of a sinking anvil, and under the strict, joyless eye of Quaker shipowner John Walker, Cook internalized a life of practical seamanship. He learned careful bookkeeping and the habit of methodical observation. These were the formative, grueling years that explain why a man of such modest origins could later command the attention of kings. He was simply too well prepared to be ignored. In June 1755, James Cook committed professional suicide. Rather than accept a comfortable, well-paying captaincy in the merchant fleet, he enlisted at Wapping as a lowly able seaman in the Royal Navy. It was a baffled reset at age 26, effectively placing him below officers who were barely old enough to shave. The move positioned him inside the only institution possessing the ships, cannons, and limitless budgets required to match his colossal ambition. The gamble paid out almost immediately. He served on HMS Eagle, passed his master's exam at Trinity House, Deptford in 1757, and proved his utility in the 7 Years' War. In a conflict where surveying and navigation decided outcomes more often than swagger, Cook's obsession with drilled routine was the perfect weapon to tame the chaos of combat. The 1760s saw him become essential. He evolved into a relentless repository of cartographic data. Promoted to master, he charted the notoriously tricky coasts of Newfoundland with such maniacal accuracy that the Navy's mapmakers adopted his sheets as the absolute standard. He also collected physical scars and philosophical lessons. A nasty powder horn injury and a ship grounding reinforced his lifelong bias for obsessive backups and hygiene. Accuracy on parchment meant safety on the water. Rigid discipline kept both the crew and the hull intact. These charts and habits became the currency that recommended him to the Admiralty and the Royal Society for the forthcoming Pacific voyage. By 1768, Cook had earned the Navy's trust through the most painful method possible: competence. The Admiralty needed a steady hand to ferry astronomers to the Pacific for the transit of Venus, and then follow sealed, top-secret orders in search of a mythical southern continent. The appointment made terrifying practical sense. Cook's Newfoundland surveys proved he was that rare turducken of an officer, part sailor, part surveyor, and part strict disciplinarian. It is harrowing to consider the sheer scale of the collision he facilitated. His arrivals triggered the irreversible dismantling of the kapu system, introduced iron that disrupted Stone Age balances, unleashed pathogens that decimated a population, and broke a cultural solitude that had held for centuries. That sequence ultimately led to the complex modern ownership I see today from my balcony at Ko Olina, where global luxury sits directly atop the restless hotspot of Pacific migration. Cook, Contested Seas, Sydney Endeavour. Obsession is a heavy burden, much like the white stone obelisk I had left behind in the volcanic haze of Keawaula Bay. My quest to understand the captain who mapped the Pacific eventually dragged me across an ocean years later to the wharves of Sydney, where a wooden avatar of his ambition awaited. I was there to inspect the HMB Endeavour replica, a pilgrimage I undertook with the solemnity of a knight seeking the Grail, or at least a tourist seeking a historically accurate photo opportunity. Standing on the immaculate deck, surrounded by locals whose pride in this vessel was palpable, I attempted a witticism regarding the captain's final spirited interaction with the Hawaiians. The silence that followed was absolute. It appeared that my commentary on 18th century cultural exchanges was as welcome as a stray spark in the powder magazine. This social gaffe prompted a swift and necessary re-education on my part regarding the vessel itself, proving that while my comedic timing remains trapped in the dark ages, the ship's engineering was timeless. A coal ship might seem an odd choice for a voyage of scientific glory, lacking the sleek lines of a frigate or the intimidation factor of a ship of the line. However, the Admiralty knew exactly what they were doing when they looked to the North Sea. The ship began life in 1764 as the Earl of Pembroke, a humble collier designed to shuttle coal between the Tyne and the Thames. Having already internalized the rigors of the Whitby maritime trade, Cook understood the utility of a bluff bow, a broad beam, and a flat bottom. It was the maritime equivalent of a delivery van, slow, stout, and entirely unconcerned with aesthetics. He knew these ships could hold massive provisions and, critically, could be beached on unknown reefs without snapping their spines. Speed was vanity. Survival was geometry. In 1768, the Navy purchased the vessel for roughly £2,840. They then spent nearly that amount again, £2,294 at Deptford, to turn a workhorse into a floating laboratory. The refit added a third internal deck to house the scientific party, including the botanist Joseph Banks. It also armed the vessel with 10 4-pounder cannons and 12 swivel guns, presumably to aggressively debate taxonomy with foreign powers. Cook did not use the Endeavour for his subsequent voyages. He switched to the Resolution and Adventure, leaving his first ship to a less glamorous destiny. Sold out of the service in 1775 to a private owner named J. Mather, she was renamed the Lord Sandwich. By the time of the American Revolution, the British government hired the ship back as a troop transport. In August 1778, the British scuttled the vessel along with other transports to create a blockade, preventing the French fleet from entering Newport Harbor in Rhode Island. She ended her life as underwater traffic control, stripped of any exploratory glory. In 2022, the Australian National Maritime Museum announced the results of a lengthy archaeological investigation. Specific timber types and scantlings found at wreck site RY2394 confirmed the remains were indeed those of the Endeavour. The ship remains a complicated icon suitable for a museum placard debate. Australia treats the sailing replica as a national beacon, a floating Mayflower of sorts. Yet during the 2019 Tuia 250 commemorations in New Zealand, the vessel's presence drew protests from some Maori communities. They viewed the ship primarily as a symbol of dispossession and the violent encounters that occurred during Cook's first landfall. No matter the modern consensus, this bluff-bowed outlier was exactly the vessel chosen to carry a sprawling, ambitious scientific entourage deep into the Pacific. Tupaia steers, Cook through Venus and Vice. Galvanized by the stern lecture I received on the Sydney docks regarding my poor historical humour, I returned to the archives to treat James Cook with the gravity the locals insisted he deserved. Reading through the departure manifests, it was easy to imagine the freighted collier groaning in its oaken cargo hold under a massive, unfamiliar weight. That structural strain signalled the arrival of a new dynamic aboard the ship. Joseph Banks. Young, wealthy, and backed by the Royal Society, Banks had stuffed the cabins with a retinue of scientists, artists, and gear, treating a naval surveillance mission like a heavily funded gap year. This injection of energy brought both headaches and benefits. Decks were crowded, and priorities competed. Yet Banks ensured the voyage would be judged not merely by nautical charts, but by a scientific haul of specimens destined to feed the gardens at Kew and the imperial ambitions of Britain. At Tahiti in 1769, the crew established a shore camp at Point Venus, a sprawling complex of tents and instruments designed to observe the transit of Venus. However, the interactions between the rigid Royal Navy and the fluid society of Tahiti often resembled a collision between naval clockwork and island reciprocity. The most dramatic divergence in protocol occurred on May 2, 1769, involving a piece of stolen astronomical equipment. It was a fascinating sociological experiment in cross-cultural inventory management. A local resident, likely motivated by a sophisticated appreciation for brass craftsmanship, initiated an unauthorized reallocation of the astronomical quadrant. This high-status object, clearly serving a ritualistic function for the visitors, was liberated from its restrictive casing in the fort. The British reaction was disproportionately theatrical. Rather than celebrating this dynamic exchange of goods, Cook engaged in a primitive display of coercive bargaining, detaining canoes in a huff until the stolen item was returned. It was a classic failure of etiquette on the part of the observers, who clearly did not understand that in a gift economy, possession is merely a temporary custodial theory. Daily life on the beach oscillated between trade, curiosity, and the occasional lethal misunderstanding. While Cook typically ordered the use of small shot, the non-lethal birdseed of the musketry world, to discourage theft, the gap between written policy and split-second panic was significant. In one instance, a Tahitian man attempting to acquire a musket was shot dead. It was an outcome Cook later regretted, but one that exposes the friction of a frontier garrison trying to maintain order on a paradise beach. Commerce, meanwhile, took a turn toward the metallic. Iron nails became the unofficial currency of the bay, an island species that sailors pried from the very planks of their own ship to trade for food and intimacy. This alarmed the officers, who found themselves in the unenviable position of policing the physical integrity of the hull alongside the moral integrity of the crew. Historians note that while Cook issued standing orders to restrict contact and prevent the spread of venereal disease, enforcement was as uneven as the coastline. Men slipped away to live ashore, seduced by a life that did not involve weevils or floggings, only to be hauled back and punished. The camp at Matavai Bay was less a vacation spot and more a tense standoff where they guarded instruments, traded for hogs, and relied on a local priest named Tupaia to keep the peace. The real turning point of the 1769 visit was not the astronomical observation, but the introduction of Tupaia. An Ario priest from Raiatea, Tupaia possessed a mental library of star paths and swell patterns. He understood the geography of the Pacific not as a blank space to be conquered, but as a known neighborhood of chiefs and transit times. Cook permitted Tupaia to join the ship. Tupaia's guidance fundamentally altered the tempo of the voyage. He served as a cultural pilot, interpreting rituals and pointing the way across vast ocean reaches that European cartographers had left discouragingly blank. His knowledge was eventually translated into a famous chart, a document that puzzled scholars for centuries because it mashed together Polynesian cognitive grids with Western compass points. It was a collaboration that gave Cook's crew a strategic edge no quadrant could offer, proving that while institutions like the Navy provide the ship, true progress often relies on a captain smart enough to ask a legitimate expert for directions. This blend of European maritime hardware and Austronesian wayfinding logic set the stage for the next leg of the journey, echoing the deep history of migration that had first populated these waters millennia before a collier from Whitby ever touched the sand. Tupaia, Botany Bay, and the Endeavour Gambit. Great navigators, much like diligent travel writers or anyone attempting to adjust a hotel room thermostat, know that the most vital tool isn't the one detailed in the manual. But how were they actually finding these places? The Admiralty and Royal Society had equipped the Endeavour with the absolute pinnacle of 18th century navigational technology, a clockwork arsenal of sextants, chronometers, and complex lunar tables designed to tame the uncaring ocean through mathematics. Tupaia, however, just looked at the clouds. His instruction involved reading the sea and sky with a casual intimacy that made the quadrant look like a paperweight. He watched birds at dawn and dusk, noted the refracted swells, and observed the loom, the subtle reflection of lagoons or pale sand bouncing off the cloud base to spot islands long before they broke the horizon. When land finally appeared, Tupaia proved just as indispensable on the beach. During early landings in New Zealand, every initial contact went badly, sliding toward violence, until Tupaia stepped forward as the expedition's cultural broker. Because his language shared roots with Maori dialects, he could translate intentions and ensure proper protocol, turning what had started as a tragic misunderstanding at Poverty Bay into a viable exchange for water, food, and safe anchorages. He was effectively the expedition's chief sensitivity officer, smoothing over the social friction while the British stood awkwardly in the back holding the muskets. The voyage successfully made its way west, arriving at a bay in April 1770, where Joseph Banks and Dr. Solander went absolutely feral for the local flora. They collected such a flood of plant specimens that James Cook, in a moment of brand management that predates modern marketing by 2 centuries, scratched out Stingray Harbour in his journal and wrote in Botany Bay. It was a neat division of labour. Cook drew the charts to satisfy the Admiralty in London, and Banks built a massive herbarium to satisfy the gardeners at Kew. Then came the checkmate. Near the Great Barrier Reef on the night of June 11th, 1770, the Endeavour did not so much find the land as the land violently found the Endeavour. The ship struck hard. In the ensuing panic to lighten the vessel, the crew heaved ballast and heavy guns overboard, cannons that were later recovered, proving that even in the 18th century, you sometimes had to throw your most expensive assets into the sea just to keep floating. Midshipman Jonathan Monkhouse then proposed fothering, a procedure that sounds vaguely obscene but is actually just disgusting. They took a sail, packed it with chopped rope, wool, and a significant amount of animal dung, and hauled it under the hull to suction into the leak. It worked well enough to limp the ship to the Endeavour River for beaching and repairs, and Cook's journal backs every step of this harrowing ordeal. It was a perfect fulfillment of two contradictory prophecies. The expedition was destined to make a deep, lasting impact on the Australian coast, and they were destined to leave behind a great legacy of British naval power. They achieved both simultaneously by crashing into the continent and dumping their heavy artillery into the coral, a survival strategy that prioritized breathing over dignity. I suppose survival, not neat order, is the only measure of command that counts when the map runs out of paper. Batavia's bitter farewell for James Cook. Scarcely had the Endeavour pushed off the Australian coast and limped into the Dutch East India Company stronghold of Batavia, now Jakarta, in late 1770, than the crew traded one existential terror for another. A reasonable person might assume that a heavily fortified European colonial port, teeming with workshops and active shipyards, would mark a triumphant return to safety. Arriving in a major hub should have been a victory. Instead, it was simply a shift in lethality. Batavia was a brilliantly engineered, canal-filled vector for malaria and dysentery. The city's reputation as an epidemiological nightmare was entirely a product of bad urban planning. Its low-lying marshes and poorly flushed waterways bred disease with administrative efficiency, a problem the Dutch East India Company failed to solve throughout the 18th century. Medical historians note periodic mortality spikes so severe that the company occasionally could not fully crew its outbound ships, running a global trade empire on a staffing model of staggering attrition and blind prayer. Calling at this specific port was a gruesome transaction. Cook traded extreme biological risk for the hull repairs necessary to keep his command afloat. 7 people from the company died while the ship remained in the docks. Then came a second, more punishing wave of mortality that swept through the men during the homeward leg in early 1771. The most profound loss to the social fabric of the voyage was Tupaia. The man whose encyclopedic knowledge of the Pacific had guided the British across an ocean they barely understood was undone by bad water and mosquito-choked air in a port designed for safety. Death continued to clear the payroll with rigid indifference. The astronomer Charles Green, whose precise transit calculations formed the mathematical spine of the mission, died on December 18th. The Finnish assistant Herman Spurring and the incredibly prolific artist Sidney Parkinson succumbed at sea in January 1771, taking countless unrecorded observations to the bottom. The toll cut straight through the warrant officers, vital to merely sailing the vessel, claiming Master Robert Molyneux and Carpenter John Satterley. The sheer scale of the casualty list turned the voyage into a grim retreat. Later journal entries describe the Endeavour not as a proud vessel of exploration, but as a floating hospital dragging its way toward the Cape of Good Hope. For James Cook, this slow biological siege hardened habits that previously only bordered on the obsessive. He enforced strict cleanliness, aggressive ration control, and draconian limits on shore contact. Furthermore, the loss of Tupaia removed the cultural intermediary who had repeatedly de-escalated trouble during earlier landfalls. Left without the guide who made his procedures tolerable to local populations, Cook grew increasingly unyielding. He returned to London a fundamentally altered commander. Looking closely at this catastrophic pit stop while sitting in my own frictionless hotel room, a persistent irony of travel becomes obvious. The most dangerous phase of a long journey is rarely the untracked margin. It is often the layover. As John A. Shedd is so often quoted as saying, "A ship in harbour is safe, but that is not what ships are built for." In Batavia, the exact opposite proved true. The harbour was a graveyard, and only the brutal, uncertain ocean offered any chance of survival. Cook chased Terra Australis into Antarctic silence. The disaster in Batavia reveals a strange paradox of travel. The most physically lethal environments are often the healthiest. After that bacterial horror show, where the humidity felt like a wet wool blanket draped over a fever dream and the canals teemed with enough pathogens to wipe out a small city, James Cook's decision to sail straight into the frozen void of the Southern Ocean feels less like a death wish and more like a hygiene strategy. I have often thought that if given the choice between malaria-ridden tropics and a sterile wall of ice, I would take the ice. At least the ice has the decency to kill you quickly without the dysentery. The mission for Cook's second voyage, 1772 to 1775, was grand, expensive, and founded entirely on a hunch. He sailed with two ships, the Resolution and the Adventure, to locate Terra Australis. Enlightenment. Thinkers insisted this theoretical southern continent must exist to balance out the landmass of the north in a sort of planetary feng shui. Cook treated the ocean not as a mystery to be feared, but as a laboratory to be bullied into submission. He measured sea temperatures, harvested iceberg shavings for fresh water, and scribbled notes with the obsessive neurosis of a doctoral student realizing their thesis is wrong. On January 17, 1773, he crossed the Antarctic Circle. He was the first commander to do so, and he found exactly 0 temperate paradises. Instead, the theory of a lush southern land yielded to hard ice, empty latitudes, and a reality vastly colder than the philosophers back in London had promised. Fog, the great anarch of the sea, split the ships in February. Tobias Furneaux, captaining the Adventure, lost contact and steered for the rendezvous at Queen Charlotte Sound. Along the way, he charted parts of Van Diemen's Land, naming Adventure Bay, and managed to sail right past the entrance to the Bass Strait. In doing so, he committed a cartographic blunder that left Tasmania glued to the Australian mainland on British charts for another generation. The two captains eventually reunited, likely exchanged a few tense words about lookouts and spyglasses, and then ranged across the South Pacific. During a stop at Tahiti in August 1773, the voyage acquired its most fascinating passenger. Omai, or Mai to use his actual name, boarded the Adventure, trading his island life for a berth on a British warship. Mai was not a random local. He was a political exile with a backstory that reads like a dynastic tragedy. He grew up on Raiatea, the son of a landholder, until the mid-1760s when the warrior chief Puni came over from Bora Bora and conquered the neighborhood. Mai's father was killed. The family was dispossessed, and Mai fled to Tahiti as a refugee. There, he worked as an assistant to a chief priest. This role equipped him with courtly manners and a knack for ritual, skills that apparently transfer quite well to the drawing rooms of London. His first meeting with the British had been considerably less cordial. He had been wounded during Samuel Wallis's arrival in 1767, a first contact that involved less handshaking and more grape shot. Yet by the time Furneaux arrived, Mai was ready to leverage the British Navy for his own ends. As the Adventure heaved in the swells, leaving the Society Islands behind, He must have asked himself the question that haunts every traveler who steps onto a strange vehicle. Is this the vessel that carries me to salvation, or have I just made a terrible mistake? The voyage relied on more than human drama. It ran on the 18th century equivalent of GPS. The Board of Longitude had issued Kendall's K1 chronometer, a precision copy of Harrison's H4 timekeeper. Astronomer William Wales sailed with Cook, while William Bailey went with Furneaux. Both men guarded these ticking boxes with their lives. Cook started as a skeptic. He was a man who trusted stars and math, not springs and gears. The K1 performed so well that he ended up calling it our never-failing guide, which is high praise from a man who barely complimented his own wife. Technology could not fix everything. In December 1773, back in New Zealand's Queen Charlotte Sound, 10 men from Furneaux's Adventure went ashore at Grass Cove and never came back. They were killed and eaten. This grim episode haunted the expedition, a violent reminder that they were uninvited guests in a complex world. Cook, meanwhile, kept pushing the Resolution into the freezer. By January 1774, he had reached 71 degrees 10 minutes south, a latitude so hostile it feels personal. He found only an icebound realm, then curved back through warmer waters, stopping at Easter Island and Tonga, ostensibly for science, but probably because everyone was tired of being cold. When he finally returned to England in 1775, he brought back charts, a new standard for polar seamanship, and definitive proof that the habitable southern continent was a myth. He had sailed to the bottom of the world to find a land of plenty and instead found a frozen wasteland. In the durable taxonomy of the modern internet, the second voyage was a classic case of task failed successfully. The most consequential outcome of the expedition, however, had already reached London aboard the returning Adventure, where Mai was about to navigate an entirely different kind of unpredictable ecosystem. Oh My in London, Empire on display. While James Cook had been busy freezing his hardtack off in the Antarctic Circle, proving with tedious and shivering competence that the southern continent was a mythical void, London had already moved on to warmer things. It is a cruel paradox of exploration that the man who executes the miserable work often receives a polite nod and a plaque, while the man with the best dinner party anecdotes secures the keys to the kingdom. Cook returned in 1774 to respectful applause. Joseph Banks, however, had skipped the second voyage to hold court in the capital and settle into the role of scientific impresario. Banks lacked a formal commission, but he wielded his wealth and his growing sway at the Royal Society like a velvet cudgel. Into this meticulously curated atmosphere stepped Mai. He had boarded the Adventure in the Society Islands and arrived in Britain as a transatlantic sensation. If Banks directed this theatre, Mai was his lead actor. He was whisked from the quarterdeck to the drawing room, received by George III, and painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds. The elites starved for novelty and treated him with the ravenous curiosity of naturalists presented with a rare botanical specimen. Contemporary diaries outline a 2-year bender of visits, gifts, and stage plays. This circus generated the image that Reynolds later immortalized in oil, rendering Mai in flowing silks and bare feet, an aesthetic filter so aggressive it smoothed all biographical complexity into noble serenity. Public fascination usually hides a spreadsheet. Banks operated with the strategic cunning of a merchant banker in a powdered wig, using his purse and network to steer the spectacle toward his own interests in botany, empire, and material exchange. This calculated tilt secured his path to a long and despotic leadership over the Royal Society. Cook, meanwhile, chafed at the relentless ceremony, possessing the drawing-room charisma of a wet mainsail. The Admiralty sensed an opportunity to monetize the public hype and soon drafted a new mission. The stated pretext was to carry Mai home, a diplomatic flourish that operated as a highly convenient cover story. It was a classic misdirection. While naval lords happily clasped hands with the public relations victory of a repatriation voyage, their actual gaze was fixed firmly over Mai's shoulder, staring hungrily toward the North Pacific and the promise of the Northwest Passage. Mai's season in London involved far more than costume and applause. He navigated a demanding code switch between his reality as a dispossessed Polynesian landowner and British expectations, executing a feat of social navigation more treacherous than dodging a coral reef. His presence forced the salons to confront a living counterexample to their armchair theories about islanders, puncturing their polite philosophies with an actual human being. The performance was entirely mutual. Britain exhibited Mai. Mai observed Britain. Reynolds painted an idealized figure, but the physical man was orchestrating a high-stakes diplomatic campaign of his own. Being the toast of London does not automatically make you a powerful ally. Most often, it simply makes you a very well-dressed hitchhiker on a Navy warship. Oh my, Cook and the Northwest Passage. So much for the velvet waistcoats and the sketch sessions with Joshua Reynolds. Standing on the lanai at Ko Olina, watching the Pacific horizon swallow the sun, I considered how jarring the transition must have been for Mai, logged by the Navy as Oh My, to trade the salons of London for the creaking timber of a ship bound for the other side of the world. In 1776, James Cook sailed again in Resolution with a sharpened brief that operated as a corporate bait and switch. Publicly, the mission was to return Oh My to the Society Islands. Privately, the Admiralty cared far less about the passenger and far more about hunting the fabled Northwest Passage from the Pacific side. The ship functioned as a floating university for future naval heavyweights. Among the new hands was the master, William Bligh, a man whose later public relations disaster involving a mutiny tends to obscure the fact that he was a gifted navigator and draftsman. Beside him was senior midshipman George Vancouver, who idolized his commander and absorbed the trade craft that he would later use to put his own name on half the maps in the Pacific Northwest. The Board of Longitude's timekeepers were back in their custom boxes, ticking away to ensure the precise landfalls that made reconnaissance work in the ice possible. I felt a profound spiritual kinship with these men of the sea. I, too, have approached the navigation of a hotel resort with the grim determination of a fleet admiral, mentally charting wind shear, solar angles and pedestrian density to optimize my trajectory toward the concierge desk. Though, to be strictly fair to Bligh and Vancouver, I recently got lost in a hallway because I was looking at a meme on my phone and walked squarely into a potted plant. A year into the voyage, the squadron reached Huahine in 1777. Cook's written orders required settling Oh My at the island of his choice, which sounds accommodating until you calculate the logistics. The mandate involved constructing a timber house, negotiating for land, and stocking the estate with goods and livestock. This was a careful, official handover rather than a hasty drop-off on a beach, a colonial deployment dutifully recorded in John Webber's graphite and watercolor views of the anchorage. Sources differ on Oh Mai's feelings about the parting. Frankly, who could blame him for being uneasy? He had spent years as the toast of London, and now he was forced to execute a precarious status shift among island chiefs who had not read the British tabloids. In a stroke of institutional genius that could only emerge from a government committee, he was settled not on his native Raiatea, but on nearby Huahine. There, he was endowed with a parting gift that perfectly encapsulated the disconnect of the entire enterprise, a full suit of armor, because nothing says practical reintegration and peaceful intentions quite like wearing 50 pounds of plate metal in the tropics. The farewell was an institutional act shaped by orders, not the whim of a quarterdeck. With Oh My ashore looking like a medieval knight who took a wrong turn during the Crusades, Cook pushed on. Bly's chart work impressed the seniors, and Vancouver graduated from eager junior to trusted surveyor. The voyage ranged deep into the North Pacific and Alaska, where the same procedural habits that carried resolution through the tropics, tight discipline and rigid charting, set the tone for the final years. Cook sailed north to find a shortcut through the ice, hoping for open water but steering directly toward an unyielding frozen wall. Cook skips Waikiki, charts Oʻahu first. Untethered from the warm anchorages of the South Pacific, untethered from the ceremonial farewells of Huahine, and untethered from the known map, the expedition sailed north, under an immense sky, under an unforgiving sun, and under a steady breeze. I stand now at Kaʻena Point State Park on the westernmost tip of Oʻahu. I find myself squinting into a glare that feels like a personal apology from the universe for the damp chill of my home in Tennessee in January. It is here that one can properly visualize the terrifying competence of James Cook. After weeks of sailing through the empty blue, his approach to the Hawaiian archipelago in January 1778 was a demonstration of cold navigational logic, unfolding with the tidy sequence of a well-rehearsed play. His primary mission was not to search for new islands in the Central Pacific. He needed to sail north to find the ocean entrance to the Northwest Passage. Heading up from Christmas Island, his crew spotted high land bearing northeast by east at daybreak on January 18, 1778. While popular memory sometimes assumes he approached Kauai first, modern scholars and log analyses reliably identify this initial landmass right here, off the bow, as Oʻahu. However, he did not stop. To the modern vacationer, skipping Waikiki seems like a severe failure of imagination. For an 18th-century captain responsible for 2 wooden tubs of weary sailors, it was a strict matter of survival physics. He read the ocean, calculated the angles, and reached a conclusion recorded with the dry formality of his era. Upon sighting the high land to the eastward, the prudent mariner observes the trade winds blowing with a most ungentlemanly vigor. The coast presents a lee shore of distinct peril, offering no safe harbourage for His Majesty's sloops. Thus, logic dictates we must snub this jagged isle and bear away for the gentle lee of the next island to the west, where water and hogs may be procured without dashing the keel upon the coral. Just kidding. Anyway, preserving the order found in his tactical summaries, Cook steered for the safer leeward coast of Kauai and made his first physical landfall at Waimea on January 20th. He utilized the favor of the winds to secure water and trade without turning his ships into expensive decorative driftwood. After a brief stop at nearby Niihau, he named the newly mapped archipelago the Sandwich Islands to honor his Admiralty patron. The visit was short and focused entirely on replenishing provisions, but it immediately sparked a booming trade economy based on iron. Curiously, Cook's crew noted that some locals on Kauai already possessed iron knives. This detail suggests that drift metal or wreckage from unseen ships had seeded the shores before the British arrived. The demand for this heavy new currency was intense. Nails and tools became instant cash, bartered for pigs, produce, and fresh water. Very quickly, this private enterprise threatened the naval structure. Sailors happily traded the ship for fleeting romance. Recognizing the clear risk to discipline, hull integrity, and the spread of venereal disease, Cook issued standing orders expressly prohibiting this private nail-for-sex trading. Naturally, his crew frequently ignored the ban. A sailor will gladly unfasten the planks beneath his own feet for a momentary distraction. To halt the quiet dismantling of his vessels, Cook tasked his blacksmiths with forging blades from scrap metal, establishing a supervised and official barter system. Because his true target was the Arctic, Cook did not allow himself to be delayed by tropical plenty. He soon resumed his northern brief and pressed onward in a stubborn quest for the icy passage that would ultimately freeze his rigging and his soul. Abandoning a tropical island full of fresh pork to go freeze in a mythological Arctic strait is not as silly as it sounds, though upon reflection, it actually is entirely silly. Cook. Cold fury at the Bering Strait. Standing in the blinding Hawaiian glare at Kaʻena Point, it is difficult to conjure the maritime misery that awaited the expedition in August 1778. One might expect the quest for the fabled Northwest Passage to be a glorious pageant of imperial destiny, a heroic ballet of sails gliding through crystalline northern waters to link the great oceans of the world. In reality, it consisted of James Cook spending weeks helplessly scraping his wooden boats against a solid block of frozen ocean, while his men ate rancid walrus. Cook steered resolution and discovery through the Bering Strait with total confidence in his charts, anticipating broad and open channels. Instead, the northern expedition met a barrier of pack ice described in the naval logs as compact as a wall, 10 or 12 feet high. The ships remained trapped at 70 degrees north in a cramped maze of drifting floes, shallow water and dangerous shorelines that threatened to crush their hulls. There was no clever navigational trick to circumvent the barrier, as the much-desired route simply did not exist. With the northern passage bolted shut, the shipboard menu collapsed inward. Hunting parties were sent out to harvest whatever local wildlife they could find, returning with creatures that defied all gastronomic logic. A walrus might be a majestic sovereign of the tundra in a modern natural history catalogue, but as a naval ration, its meat amounted to a direct assault on the human digestive tract. Reviewing the logs centuries later, the Seattle Times noted with extreme journalistic self-restraint that the sailors complained about having to supplement dwindling rations with walrus meat. This polite phrasing masks the gruesome reality of men forced to chew on what effectively tasted like oily, foul-smelling rubber. Morale sank precisely in tandem with the plummeting temperature. As the Arctic fog securely closed around them, the atmosphere on the quarterdeck shifted from scientific curiosity to grim panic. Here lies the fundamental paradox of the expedition. The most enlightened navigational minds of the 18th century, armed with advanced timepieces and brilliant mathematical theory, found that their vast intellectual superiority could only be maintained through the primitive application of a whip. Punishments spiked dramatically, with one academic count noting 66 floggings. Cook, previously known as a cool-headed commander, unraveled into a stressed authoritarian violently lashing his crew. William Bligh, the ship's master, observed this strict and fraying routine with the keen eye of a man who would eventually become naval history's poster boy for workplace tension. A young George Vancouver also watched, absorbing the stark lesson that when technical perfection fails against solid ice, one must manage scarcity through terror. The expedition finally turned the bow south, abandoning the undefeated ice wall and retreating toward the milder anchorages of the Pacific. Yet before they left the freezing fog, the shipboard community engaged in a highly structured ritual of disciplinary subtraction to manage their failing stores. When a sailor engaged in the unauthorized redistribution of scarce goods, the command instituted the ceremonial cropping of the offender's ears, a practice carefully preserved from the earlier Friendly Islands phase of the voyage. To an untrained observer, this might appear as a brutal physical mutilation born of a desperate captain's fraying nerves. However, a rigorous analysis suggests it was a complex social performance designed to enforce the sacred boundaries of maritime property. The officers, acting as the high priests of shipboard order, sought to bestow profound lessons in communal harmony upon the crew. The chaotic resulting scene, complete with intense shouting and significant localized bleeding on the damp wooden deck, must simply be understood as a tragic failure of etiquette on the part of the thief, who clearly misread the delicate social nuances required to properly accept such a permanent lesson in nautical ownership. Cook crowned at Keaula Bay. Standing in the afternoon heat at Kaʻena Point, I mentally track the logs of the Resolution and Discovery south from that frozen northern barricade. It is a relief to imagine the crew trading retreating pack ice and rotting marine mammal meat for a tropical climate. The cultural pivot was equally jarring. On one side sailed the Georgian Royal Navy, a rigid hierarchy powered by mathematical anxiety and a strict aversion to joy. On the other waited the Makahiki, a Hawaiian season dedicated to agricultural abundance and festive peace. The collision resembled placing a tribunal of frostbitten actuaries inside a harvest jubilee. Cook pushed past Maui, sighting the island on November 26, 1778, and steered through the channels with the cautious precision of a man threading a needle in a gale. That cautious route eventually led to a fateful wintering at Keaula Bay on the Big Island in January 1779. Cook arrived during the height of the Makahiki, a period honoring Lono, the Hawaiian god of peace and fertility. Local priests conducted the veteran surveyor to the Hikiau Heiau, a sprawling temple structure built from slick, dark stone. Here they wrapped the pale, strict Yorkshireman in a red cloak and honored him with rites entirely reserved for the highest echelons of society. The European endeavor to map the Pacific often operated as a strict administrative logic imposed upon local divinity. This relentless cartographic mandate aimed to convert a deeply animated cosmology into a standardized grid of latitudes, magnetic variations, and safe anchorages. Rituals of the harvest were met with the rituals of the Admiralty Board, transforming the sovereign mysteries of the ocean into a neat ledger of imperial geography. Academic historians continue to debate whether the native population literally believed this overworked ship captain was the physical incarnation of Lono himself. It is a scholarly dispute fought with the ferocity of a tavern riot, but the ritual timing undeniably dictated the warm reception. I pause my own retracing of the route right here, visualizing the commander standing awkwardly in that red cloak upon the dark stone. The scene mirrors the ancient Greek concept of theoxany, the literary tradition of humble mortals unknowingly entertaining gods in disguise. The situation at Keaula Bay simply reversed the roles. A mortal naval officer was treated entirely as divine, completely unaware that the ceremonial script of the Makahiki included a final act. It is the sort of dramatic irony that makes for excellent theatre, provided you are not the person currently wearing the feathers and attempting to decipher local protocol. Cook's Keaula Reckoning. You can feel the narrative tension snap long before the mast does. The grand ceremonies at the heiau were over. The script of the Lono season had concluded with the requisite pomp, and the Resolution and Discovery had sailed on February 4, 1779, presumably to continue their epic scouring of the Pacific. But the ocean had other plans. Within days, a gale shredded the Resolution's rigging and snapped the foremast. This forced Cook into a humiliation that every retreating traveler fears. It was the awkward return to a host you have already said goodbye to. The ships limped back into Keaula Bay on February 11th, but the welcome had worn thin. The Makahiki was finished. The bay was no longer a stage for divine reception, it was just a harbour. And the gods, having returned with broken sticks and a need for repairs, looked suspiciously like mortals. The mood shifted from deified guest to overstaying relative who had depleted the pantry. Repair parties went ashore, and Lieutenant James King began dragging the shattered mast up the beach while the blacksmith set up shop to forge trade iron. The market, however, had changed. The islanders were now requesting iron daggers rather than nails, a subtle hint that the diplomatic dynamic was deteriorating. Trading grew prickly and petty thefts spiked. On the night of February 13th, the Discovery's large cutter, a vessel essential for this gloomily grand expedition, vanished from its buoy. Cook watched his patience erode after the gale and his sudden demotion from deity to nuisance. He resolved to fix the theft with a standard naval tactic. It is a specific traveler's folly to lose a boat, at which point the local political hierarchy fulfills its cosmic purpose by ruining your plans with a cheerful lack of empathy. Cook responded by deciding to block the bay's canoes and detain a high-ranking chief until the stolen property was returned. It was a routine hostage method and a bureaucratic lever of power. The target was Kalaniʻopuʻu, the Ali'i Nui. At first light on February 14th, Cook landed at Keawaula with Marines. He walked the elderly ruler toward the beach, hand in hand. The scene must have looked surreal. It was a gentle stroll, masking an abduction, but the alarm spread quickly. Kanikapolai, one of the king's wives, pleaded with him to stop. Armed men closed in. The air grew heavy with the sort of humidity that precedes thunder. Stones began to fly. From the water, the geometry of the skirmish looks wrong. William Bligh watches from the boats. He sees Cook advance farther up the beach than prudence allows, with the Marines strung out and the king by his side. It is the kind of quiet that feels expensive. The boats sit close enough to hear voices, but too far to intervene effectively. Bligh grips the gunwale. He is a man destined for mutinies, observing a disaster that for once is not his fault. Farther out, George Vancouver views the scene with the detached clarity of a future cartographer. He dislikes the spacing. The crowd is not rushing, it is closing, hydraulic and inevitable. Chiefs slip into the gaps where safety should be. Cook stops, the king stops. The moment stretches thin and intensely fragile. Then someone moves. A man steps forward with traded iron. This was the very currency of their friendship, now forged into a threat. Cook turns and lifts a hand. The gesture represents neither an attack nor a retreat, but perhaps a sudden recognition of his error. The first stone strikes him. Vancouver sees Cook jolt. Bligh freezes. There is no firing line, only a knot of bodies folded together in a lethal scramble. Cook moves toward the water. He does not run but seeks the open space the ocean usually provides. His boots slip on the lava stones at the surf's edge, and suddenly the space collapses. Vancouver loses him in the press, then finds him again. Cook is already down with his knees in the shallows. The surf breaks around a legend suddenly reduced to biology. A club falls. Then a blade follows. Bligh sees only the fall, the brief lift of Cook's head, and the water darkening around his shoulders. A musket cracks from the boats, followed by another, but the sound scatters uselessly. Smoke hangs low over the water. Vancouver grips the thwart until his knuckles turn white. He watches the king get pulled back to safety. He watches Cook's body dragged from the water, vanishing behind the wall of the crowd. The beach empties in fragments. The boats drift, rudderless in the sudden vacuum of authority. The surf resumes its rhythm, indifferent to the history it just washed away. Decades later, George Vancouver would return in 1794. He wrote of the memorable spot where Captain Cook unfortunately fell a sacrifice to his undaunted and enterprising spirit. He added that despite that melancholy instance, Keaula had proved an asylum. It was a masterpiece of diplomatic balance. Vancouver mourned the man while praising the real estate, advancing a courteous fiction that suited his new mission with Kamehameha. The sun having dipped below the horizon, and the bay returning to its customary silence, We lay upon our oars, observing the dark shore, where so great a navigator met his sudden end, and finding the reception of the inhabitants to be irrevocably altered. Keaweula Bay, Cook's Bones and Blank Maps. Upon the water, the silence that followed the cracked musket fire felt heavier than the iron ballast in the Resolution's hold. The beach at Keaweula Bay had emptied of the skirmish, and the body of James Cook was gone, carried inland by the victors not as a spoil of war, but as a vessel of volatile power. In the high sanctuaries of the uplands, the priests began the work that would horrify the British and honor the alii, the ritual stripping of the flesh. To the Hawaiians, loosely baking the corpse to separate bone from meat was a high liturgy of respect, transforming a formidable rival into a sacred relic imbued with mana. To the sailors waiting offshore, peering through spyglasses at the smoke rising from the temple, it looked like the work of monsters. Captain Charles Clark took command despite his own failing health, with despair gnawing at him like a shipboard rat. He struggled to encompass the obligations of a pristine naval officer while realizing the diplomatic framework had entirely collapsed. He pushed the men to repair the mast and opened negotiations for the return of his commander, an effort as delicate as mending a chronometer with a sledgehammer. A priest eventually rowed out to Lieutenant King, acting as an intercessor between two worlds that had ceased to understand each other. What followed was a grim installment plan of restitution. First came a thigh, then arms, legs, the skull and hands. The British received these fragments with stiff formality. They performed a burial at sea in the bay, executing a procedural necessity to close the logbook on a disaster. The rest of the bones vanished into the island's secret history, likely housed in shrines until the changing gods and mission politics of the 19th century swept them into obscurity. By the 1820s, the trail was cold. Some whispered of hidden caves, while others suspected iconoclastic destruction. The narrative friction here was not about cannibalism, a word the Admiralty later loved to deploy with Gothic regularity, but about competing funerary codes. One side saw bones as conduits of divine force, while the other saw a named grave as the only valid receipt for a life spent at sea. The rigid machinery of British procedure, usually so effective at turning the globe into a filing cabinet, had jammed hopelessly against the calendar and pride of the Kona coast. The 1790s arrived, and the surviving actors scattered into their own grim futures. Bligh stands on the quarterdeck of the Bounty, his voice a weapon, proving that while discipline can hold a ship together, it cannot synthesize loyalty. Far to the north, George Vancouver, having learned the hard lesson of the fatal shore, traces the coastlines with agonizing care. He exchanges gifts and keeps his distance, ensuring his maps are inked in caution rather than blood. In London, an aging Joseph Banks sits with his dried flowers. He labels the past in careful script, reducing the roar of the Pacific to a quiet botany lesson. But in Hawaii, a different silence spreads. It travels not with gunpowder, but on breath. There is no ceremony for the pathogens that arrive without manifests. Children weaken, the old rhythms falter, and the population begins a slow, tragic contraction that no chant can reverse. The Pacific maps are filled, the blank spaces conquered by ink and confidence, but the ocean remains indifferent to the lines drawn upon it. We ended our day of historical reckoning not with a somber banquet or a pouring of libations, but with a plastic bag of King's Hawaiian rolls and pressed ham from a convenience store. We consumed this meal in the air-conditioned neutrality of our room. Tomorrow, we will don masks and fins to submerge ourselves in the bay, leaving the complex socio-economics of dry land behind to stare at fish who have no interest in who stole the cutter. History is a set of lies agreed upon. Napoleon Bonaparte? And that brings us to the close of Chapter 3. Snorkel tomorrow, rethink Cook today. The big takeaway here is that Cook's death at Keaula Bay makes a lot more sense when it stops being the whole story and becomes one consequence inside a longer Hawaiian account of protocol, power, and who controls the terms of an encounter. Next time, in Chapter 4, the snorkeling finally happens at Hanauma Bay. A monk seal shows up uninvited, and a television show about Hawaiian warfare opens a door into the chaotic, gun-running, score-settling years that followed Cook's voyages and set the islands on a very different course. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, The Papayas of Wrath. And if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join the community over on Patreon. Thanks for listening to The Rise the Limit.